What was the Arab Spring? Imagine you are sitting at a small weathered table outside a traditional cafe in a deeply ancient city. It is the early spring of 2011 and a gentle breeze is blowing through the narrow, historic streets of Daraa, a quiet city in southern Syria. You look up and see old mosques and towering minarets that have stood as silent witnesses of centuries of human history, completely undisturbed. You are sitting across from a man named Omar. Omar is a local school teacher, a man who has dedicated his entire life to the quiet, noble belief that the pen will always be far mightier than sword. As you sip your tea, Omar and his friends lean in close, lowering their voices as they excitedly discuss the sudden, intoxicating winds of change sweeping across the Arab world. They talk about freedom, they talk about democracy, and they genuinely believe that their beautiful, peaceful city is about to become the birthplace of a glorious national awakening. But if Omar knew what was actually coming, he would have never sat in that cafe. Because that romantic dream of spring revolution was about to unleash a nightmare so terrifying, so absolute that it would completely change the history of Syria and the entire Arab world forever. You probably remember how the Western media portrayed this exact moment. They broadcast a massive, highly coordinated propaganda campaign promising the world that a beautiful democratic transformation was finally arriving in the Middle East. But did the democracy arrive? Not even close. Instead, those exact Arab countries became the breeding ground for some of the most ruthless, terrifying terrorist organizations in the human history, including the catastrophic rise of ISIS. How does a peaceful protest about civil rights mutate into a bloodbath that leaves 500,000 people dead? And more importantly, how did invisible hands recently use this exact same psychological blueprint to try and turn the nation of Pakistan into a second Syria? But we will get to the terrifying political conspiracy, the shocking events of May 9th, and the dangerous illusion of a purposeless revolution in just a moment. First, to truly understand how a country is systematically burned to the ground, we have to look at how the Syrian power was actually built. See, revolutions do not just fall out of the sky, they are results of decades of deep and visible pressure. In Syria, that pressure had been violently building up under the iron fist of a single ruling family. Hafiz al-Assad took absolute control of the country back in 1971, ruling with a ruthless, uncompromising grip for 30 long years. When he passed away in the year 2000, he handed the keys of the kingdom directly to his son, Bashar al-Assad, who had been sitting on the throne for 70 years by the time Omar and his friend started whispering in the cafe in Daraa. The ordinary citizens of Syria were deeply, profoundly exhausted by the Assad regime, and their anger was fueled by three highly combustible elements. First, there was a deeply toxic religious sectarianism dividing the country. Bashar al-Assad belongs to the Alawite Shia sect, which is actually a very small religious minority within the broader Syrian population. Over the years, massive allegations piled up claiming that Assad was systematically favoring his own sect, handing the most powerful, lucrative, and critical government positions exclusively to Alawite loyalists while completely marginalizing the majority. Second, the economic engine of the country had completely stalled out. When the massive global financial crisis of 2008 shattered the American economy, the shock waves aggressively rippled straight into Arab world, hitting Syria incredibly hard. For several years, the Syrian economy had essentially flatlined, failing completely to deliver the kind of rapid growth and opportunity that younger generation desperately needed to survive. And the third element is where the true, terrifying reality of global geopolitics come into play. It was all about Syria's global alliances. Bashar al-Assad had firmly parked his country in the geopolitical camps of Russia and Iran. This strategic alignment deeply angered and frustrated both United States and Saudi Arabia. The Western Bloc and the Gulf monarchies looked at the map, saw an Iranian ally sitting right in the heart of Levant, and they desperately wanted to engineer a way to topple Assad and install a complete pro-Western government of their own choosing. To truly understand how brutally superpowers interfere in the domestic politics of this Arab nation, let me pause and share an incredibly interesting, almost unbelievable historical fact with you. Let's look at the neighboring country of Lebanon for a second. The year is 2017. Saad Hariri, the sitting Prime Minister of Lebanon, travels to Saudi Arabia for what is supposed to be a routine official state visit. But shortly after his arrival, something utterly bizarre happens. A video suddenly airs across Arab media that sends an absolutely earthquake through the political landscape of Lebanon. It is Saad Hariri sitting in front of a camera on foreign soil, suddenly announcing his immediate resignation as Prime Minister, aggressively citing the growing influence of Iran in Lebanon as his primary reason. Can you imagine the sheer panic in Beirut? But the Lebanese people were not fools. They completely refused to accept his resignation. The vast majority of the public immediately realized that Saudi Arabia had essentially kidnapped their prime minister and forced him to read that resignation letter under extreme duress. The crisis became so intense that the French president had to personally intervene and fly to Riyadh to negotiate his release. Hariri eventually returned to Lebanon, miraculously withdrew his forced resignation, and continued serving as the prime minister all the way until 2020. I'm telling you this story for a very specific reason. This is exactly how deep, how blatant, and how ruthless the interference of regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran is in the Arab world. They treat sovereign nations like disposable chessboards. And this exact same foreign interference was actively pouring gasoline on the religious division inside Syria, completely manipulating the local population to fight a proxy war on behalf of the foreign empires. So what happens when you combine an angry, disenfranchised youth, a stalled economy, and a massive foreign empires pouring weapons and money into your streets? You get absolute, unmitigated annihilation. The United Nations estimates that during the Syrian civil war, over 400,000 human beings violently lost their lives. Other independent organizations put that staggering death toll at 600,000 or even higher. Today, more than half of the entire Syrian population is living as displaced refugees, scattered across cold camps and foreign borders. The national economy is completely, irreparably destroyed. If you were to walk into the refugee camp today and ask any surviving Syrian if the protests of 2011 brought them any good, absolutely no one would give a positive answer. Why? Because they learned the hardest, most painful lesson of political science. You cannot just tear down a system because you're angry. A true, successful revolution absolutely requires a highly detailed, functional blueprint. Think about the sheer mechanics of running a country. A revolutionary leader must provide a complete, bulletproof plan. If we overthrow the government today, how exactly will we achieve economic growth tomorrow? How will we instantly improve the agricultural sector so our people do not starve? What is the exact mathematical system for our national food security? How will we solve complex, deeply rooted national problems, and how exactly will the daily life of the common man be practically improved? What will the new structure of the government actually look like, and how will we enforce the rule of law? When revolutionary leaders whip the public into frenzy but completely fail to answer these fundamental questions, you do not get the utopia. You get exactly what happened in Syria. You get a completely purposeless revolution that washes away every single pillar of civilization like a catastrophic flood, leaving nothing behind but warlords, terrorism, and massive graves. And this is where the story shifts from the tragic ruins of Middle East directly to the street of your own home. Because not so long ago, a highly coordinated attempt was made to bring this exact same brand of purposeless destructive revolution straight into Pakistan. The date was May 9, following the sudden arrest of the former chairman of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, Imran Khan. A massive orchestrated wave of violence was unleashed across the country. But this was not a peaceful political protest. The crowds were actively manipulated and pushed out onto the streets to launch direct, coordinated physical attacks against the absolute core of the Pakistani state, the armed forces. They literally set fire to the historical residence of the corps commander. The people executing these attacks, the young men and women caught in the emotional frenzy of the moment, genuinely harbored the exact same romantic desires of sudden revolution as Omar did in that Syrian cafe. But just like the protesters in Daraa, they were operating completely blind. They had absolutely no idea how to actually bring about a functional revolution, and they were completely oblivious to ultimate terrifying purpose behind the chaos they were creating. Imagine if those violent mobs had successfully fractured the chain of command and managed to completely divide the armed forces from within. What would the morning after look like? I will tell you exactly what it would look like. Pakistan's gross domestic product would have instantly collapsed into the dirt. The fragile economy would have completely evaporated, and without a unified, powerful military to hold the borders and maintain internal security, various voluntarist organizations would have immediately swept down and established brutal, independent fiefdoms across different regions of the country. We would have been looking at a mirror image of the Syrian nightmare, complete with heavily armed militias roaming the streets of our major cities. By the grace of God Almighty, Pakistan was saved from this massive existential destruction. The state held its ground, but the terrifying reality is that even today, the vast majority of our people remain completely unaware of how incredibly close came to the edge of the abyss. We remain dangerously ignorant of the catastrophic historical consequences that naturally follow these kind of blind, emotional uprising on the global stage. We are so easily seduced by beautiful, empty slogans. You will hear grand, sweeping promises that once the system is burned down, highly educated expatriates will suddenly flock back to Pakistan to take up jobs and build a paradise. But you will never see a single shred of a realistic, structured plan to make that happen. You will constantly hear wild claims that $200 billion of looted national wealth will magically be recovered and distributed to the poor. But again, there is absolutely no legal or economic blueprint provided to explain how such a miracle would actually be executed. The purpose of examining this dark chapter of history is not to single out or criticize anyone's specific political party. It is about raising a much more fundamental life or death question for your own survival. Dreaming of change is a beautiful, natural human instinct, and wanting a better future for your children is never a bad thing. But before you ever decide to march out into streets, before you ever decide to pick up a stone, and before you ever land your voice to a revolution that seeks to tear down the pillars of your own state, you must stop and ask yourself one critical question. Look closely at the leaders who are demanding you risk your life, your freedom, and the safety of your country in the name of change. Do they actually have a concrete, functional plan to rebuild the house they are asking you to burn down? Or are they just handing you the matches? Because if there is no blueprint, you are not marching towards a revolution. You are marching directly into the ashes of a second Syria.